Hello and welcome to Can We Have Your Attention, the Attention Economy podcast with myself, James Wickham. I'm a broadcaster and journalist, and with Claire Coady, the founder of the Attention Practice. Hello, Claire.
Hi, James.
Hi. Now, we have got an absolutely fascinating guest today, and we are taking a bit of a left turn. We have talked in the last episode, of course, with Catherine Templar-Lewis, which I thought was personally absolutely fascinating. We talked about uncertainty.
Brilliant work.
Well, let's talk today a bit about radicalisation and about how attention is bought and by those people who really want to radicalise younger people. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Herron. He is a visiting scholar at Queen's University Belfast, runs an advertising and marketing agency called White Hawk Marketing in Belfast, and he is an expert on radicalisation. Now, he spent years researching the transition of veterans into civilian life, starting with the Ulster Defence Regiment, who operated during the Troubles. That has led into wider work on radicalisation itself. Now, he's talking about the far right and then into Islamic terrorism. And crucially for our podcast, as I mentioned, a look at how these mostly, let's be honest, young men are recruited and the tactics used to get their attention. And he's come at this from a slightly different angle, Claire.
He has. So, James, as you said, he got into his work by looking at veterans first, but was then pulled into Islamic terrorism because I think there was a realization that the tactics and the narratives and themes are very similar. So you wouldn't think that, when you look at things like extremism, people tend to focus on the kind of person, but what they don't focus on is how they're brought in. And part of the reason I was introduced to him originally was because I've worked on big global brands, and particularly brands that reach younger people. And one of the observations that I've had is that there's significant overlap between the way that brands, the things they see in young men, and the things that, radical and extremist groups also see in young men. The problem is that all that ground is being ceded to radical and extremist groups, particularly as we're more siloed. So Stephen's work on how that happens, what people need to think about, is incredibly useful and interesting for all of us to hear, I think.
Absolutely. Well, he spoke to us about his career and what we can learn from those who try to attract young people to a radical cause. It is a fascinating listen. Here's Stephen.
The conflict in Northern Ireland provided, again, some illumination. We explored the narratives and approach by respective sides, for the want of a better way to describe it, where for those on the loyalist side, there's much more likely to be a romantic idea of the past, a defensive approach, defending the line as such. Whereas for an Irish Republican side, there's a much more goal-orientated approach. There's an objective there, unification of Ireland and so on. So you can see the defence against the attack and so on. And that provided some interesting early comparative ideas in terms of Islamic jihadists and far-right material, where the far-right more generally I was seeing much more the defensive capacity, about harking back to a romantic idea of the past that never truly existed, but they shape it in that mindset and that framework. For some of the Islamic jihadist side, you can see a goal-oriented approach there in terms of some of their language, their narratives, the heavy reliance on symbolism and so on that they use. The advancement of a certain type of Islam, things they got there.
Yeah.
And the lessons then from the conflict here, while not directly applicable, certainly provided a foundation for saying, right, perhaps there's some interesting benefits and so on from this research that could be applied to a much more bigger comparative analysis of Islamic jihadist and far-right material. And that's how that journey from my side began, and then developing contacts and relationships with a lot of colleagues to expand on that research.
So in terms of our podcast, of course, we are all about the attention economy and the role of attention. And what you do is absolutely fascinating, because one of the areas that obviously you can look at is radicalisation and how, we are largely, I think, going to talk about young men, although we will talk about various different roles a little bit later on in this podcast. But about how those young men have their attention taken by these far-right jihadist groups.
Or captured, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I suppose let's start there, really. What are they doing to get the attention of these young people?
Yeah, and this is where, again, my research on veteran transition, I think, has provided some interesting insight into that process. And I'll make this clarification. For most ex-service personnel and so on, they make a really good transition, and there are no real issues, especially of this extreme nature. But nonetheless, there are some interesting insights can be gained from that. Principally, the lack of a sense of belonging. This sense of making a transition from a group or an organisation where you're part of a bubble, where one's comrade can become one's metaphorical brother. You're not just on the battlefield for the flag, you're on the battlefield engaged in highly kinetic environments for your brother beside you, as such, on the battlefield. When you make that transition, the lack of belonging, the lack of certainty in an uncertain environment is a very scary place. You take that and you apply that to different social contexts, for example, across the UK, where certain young men, groups and so on, who are in socially deprived areas, don't feel part of something, feel marginalised from broader society, have that message reinforced through misinformation and disinformation, which is fired out en masse across social media outlets and so on. You can see there how that snowball effect can take effect.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I was reading some research over the weekend from someone called Mark Hadfield, who runs a research agency in the UK called We Are the 85%, doing fascinating research on the state of the UK, state of, particularly outside of London, right? And one of the things that he spoke about was for young people in 2025, there's a real sense of uncertainty. It's a weakness, really. Even while there's strong community ties, there's a feeling that they can, to a degree, direct their own future. They're genuinely concerned about misinformation and not knowing what to trust or who to trust. Reading between the lines, it looks a little bit like they're seeing cautionary tales almost of people going into groups that maybe they know they don't want to be into. Yeah. But they know it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. And again, that's a really, really valid point, because it's reinforcing a trend that you see where there's really not much out there in terms of a positive outlook for the future. And if you're already facing an uncertain present, you want some certainty, especially if you think there's going to be an uncertain future. Hence why some of these groups can be very attractive to young men and so on who find themselves socially disadvantaged, socially marginalised and so on, that they seek a sense of belonging.
And they do speak with certainty as well. It's one of those things where I think maybe in the past, because we had effectively, a few really credible, well-known sources of information, those have been drowned out really by, pretty democratic social media environment, made probably a bit more changeable, but that has led to a sense that, there's nothing that's reliable, right? And if you're getting uncertainty in the world and then all the information you're getting is telling you to be uncertain, whoever has the strongest voice of certainty kind of wins, right? And there is behavioral science and psychological evidence to say that's a common effect, right? That whoever speaks loudest and most confidently ends up getting support, even if they're wrong. Because they just sound right.
Yeah, it's that sense of reassurance.
Yeah.
And just in terms of how they sound right, would you say that there are certain methods? I mean, it's quite difficult, this, because on one hand, I want you to go into what they are, but on the other hand, that kind of gives people a good way of knowing what they are, if that makes sense, the bad actors. But are there certain types of language, visual and audio language, that these groups use in order to attract these young men?
Yeah. An interesting point. What we are finding, again, it comes back to the sense of reassurance and certainty. There's certainly an approach which harks back to a romantic idea of the past, that to bring that sense of what they would describe as community spirit in a very socially constructed sort of way that they've constructed themselves, this sense of togetherness through their eyes, and so on. This sense of harking back, as I say, to a romantic idea of the past that never really existed, but it's a very much closed idea of the past in that sense, but a much more, they say, certain idea of the past. Even in terms of faith, we are seeing evidence, even for example here in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, a certain movement back towards faith, because it provides that sense of reassurance and certainty in, again, an uncertain world. This in itself could cause problems for faith leaders, because they will see a rise in attendances and so on. But why is that the case? So there could be that sense of right, numbers are increasing, but why? So there's important debates to be had, discussions to be had right across a number of social platforms, networks, community networks, faith-based networks, and so on. There's so much more here that needs to be looked into. It's
Yeah.
It's fascinating, but also rather scary at the same time.
Well, absolutely. But I was just wondering as well. I mean, I suppose this is almost a rhetorical question, but the very nature of social media means that those voices that are the most amplified are often the loudest in terms of either the wildest or the shoutiest or whatever.
Yeah.
So even if they then go back to faith, I assume the faith that they're going back to is a largely much more hardline version of that faith than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, I can imagine it's quite orthodox Catholicism, for example.
Again, much more traditional because it feeds into that sense of seeking reassurance and clarity and some degree of certainty in an uncertain environment.
I know Claire's got loads of questions, but I've just one more from me, and it's a big one, so you may not be able to answer it because I don't think anyone can. Is the reason for all of this because our society is breaking apart or has broken apart? And that has been amplified in part by the proliferation of social media and the lack of those kind of structural norms that we used to have. You would have pillars of society like the BBC, the NHS, and, the fact that we all believed in vaccines. And those are slowly going away.
This is an interesting point and this is an interesting question because I've had this discussion and debate with a number of colleagues about the importance of social media in the 21st century. This is as much as maybe an opinion as fact, but we'll say it anyway. I have a genuine fear about where the future is heading with regard to information technology, communication tools, and so on. No matter what we may think about the structures of the state and the government and so on, a democracy lies on faith in that system as such, to some degree. We may criticise them, we may think they're the worst thing since whatever, until the next group comes in, but the fundamental basis of a democracy is, right, the structures we do, to some degree, believe in them. If you're being fed disinformation and misinformation day in, day out, where you start to mistrust so much, does the whole thing then come full circle where you believe in nothing? If society gets to that point where they become so untrusting, the foundations of a democracy and the structures of the state are very much called into question. And that's something that I fear we're going down a very slippery slope.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm thinking about as well all of the work that's done into media literacy, right, which is an incredibly important tool. But a lot of the tactical side of it is actually having people question information, right? Yeah. And go to exhaustive lengths to question it. You can't set that up without also saying question traditional media as well. That is a foundational tenet of media literacy. But with the volume of information we have and how different it all is, and we're heading into the nothing is true and everything is possible, scenario that Peter Pomerantsev outlined, is that, and I agree, that can't possibly be a good place to be.
So is it rescuable, do you think? Are we too far gone? Because I don't think, let's be honest, with the amount of money that various social media companies are making, that they're going to roll back and suddenly go, oh, we're bad for society, we're all going to shut up shop tomorrow.
Oh, no, definitely not.
The one hope I suppose I have in that scenario is that, to use a COVID example, when COVID struck, there were some who said, right, society will never be the same again. We'll be so used to basically being separated that society will never return to a sense of normality. But we have seen how society can reform itself and certainly go back. So using that as an example, there is hope. But I do think it would be prudent to be aware of the dangers that if we don't, at the very least, don't be aware of that. That we're not ready to try and deal with any scenario arising from that. AI, again, is the catch, is the cool word of the moment, a cool phrase of our time, is a worrying tool in some respects. You see, week in, week out, the growth in sophistication in terms of AI-generated videos. And I've noticed through my own research, this increasing apprehension by people even when they post comments on videos. Is this AI? Is this real?
Oh, yeah. My beloved baseball team posted a CGI edited video, when they were, and someone said, it's AI. I said, no, it's CGI. It's different. Like, we've forgotten these things exist.
It's a worrying trend about the number of people who now comment that, is it actually real? Is it AI generated?
Yeah.
And if you continue in that trend, coupled with increasingly sophisticated AI generated video technology, you can see where this path's heading.
Yeah.
And that is somewhat worrying.
So I want to return to a second back to the construction of identity and how that's used in social media. So one of the things I've been thinking about over the weekend and listening and reading back some of the work Derek Thompson's been publishing recently and Adam Mastriani has been about the fact that with social media and with digital media in particular, the gift of it, right, is being able to target anyone, anywhere. But increasingly brands and companies have looked at it as everyone, everywhere. Yeah. But it's, thinking about your work and reading back through it, these groups, these far-right groups, jihadi extremist groups, they're not targeting everyone everywhere. Yeah. They're targeting specific groups. Like some of the stuff they do, right, particularly the very, let's say, theatrical elements of ISIS's propaganda 10 years ago was meant for a much wider audience. But generally speaking, their messages are constructed for a specific audience. Yeah. And that's what seems to cut through. Is there something else going wrong that maybe brands and government are missing by trying to be too broad?
The brand connection is something I find really fascinating. And I'm currently working on a piece of work which is exploring the marketing techniques of Islamic jihadists. And we're in the early stages of that piece of work. But you can already see from the initial research that the lessons that can be learned from Islamic jihadist networks and so on to many sectors who rely on marketing, branding and so on. To take a step back from that, I often use the Capitol Hill insurrection, shall we say, a few years ago, as an interesting case point. No matter what anybody feels about that incident, and there's so many different perspectives and so on, I don't think that incident would have happened in the way it did if those who took part in it didn't feel they had such a large section of the population who were at least complicit in some of the views and concerns that they had. I'm not saying they were anywhere going to follow them out onto Capitol Hill, onto Washington, but such a large section had, right. There are many concerns there that I share with them, not give those who actually went out the confidence to do what they did. You take that mindset on to other contexts and so on. For example, high-end brands rely not just on the core customer base. They rely on a large swathe of the population who are wanting to be part of that, but can't financially afford it.
Yeah, I remember back when, Facebook was in its teenage years, someone had started a Chanel page and it had something like 4 million followers. And this is when that was an ungodly number of followers on a page. And Chanel had nothing to do with it. In fact, I think in an ideal world, they would have wanted it taken down at the time. But it was just a symptom of how powerful that brand was and how many people subscribed to it. A tiny, less than 1% fraction of those people following that would actually have owned anything Chanel made. But it was more what it stood for.
Yeah. And if you apply that mindset to the extreme environment, large number of supporters, a large number of people who are, yes, I buy into that to some degree, but is that their large support or certainly sympathetic base that gives the confidence for that smaller network to make that final step, to be the customers or the clients, the actual recruits, clients, and customers?
Maybe not even sympathetic. It might just be, well, I know that there's different tactics and techniques that they use, which we'll come on to in a second. But what you're talking about as well reminds me of, I remember when I first started working in advertising. Do you remember the Boddington ads from the 90s?
The cream of Manchester. They've just brought it back.
The cream of Manchester. Yeah. Someone told me that, teenage boys in the 90s, these were collector's items, the print versions of it. They would have them hanging on their walls. Now, vanishingly few people drank Boddingtons, and they didn't expect really those sales to increase that much. What they wanted, though, was for the people, and particularly younger men, like say in their early 20s, who were ordering it at the pub, for their friends to think it was okay, right? It's not an old man's drink. It's, it's semi-sophisticated. They weren't aiming for anything like the Guinness thing we see today. They were just aiming for acceptability among Boddington's drinkers. And that was the thrust of that entire campaign, which included, for anyone who doesn't know, Melanie Sykes is, I think, what would her equivalent be today? I don't know. Someone from someone from Love Island, Melanie Sykes in an ice cream van, like selling ice cream in a TV ad. The ads were incredibly sophisticated, but very like cheeky and witty, and the entire intent was to make it permissible for young men to order them. Yeah. Which is basically, I think it's kind of, what you're saying, right? It's not saying, oh, I would do that or I would join that, but going, well, it's kind of his thing, isn't it?
Yeah, you're quite right. And even in terms of fashion sense and so on, certain clothing, certain things they got there, you can see that appeal to young men. And again, those young men who will be involved in certain networks, you can see the correlation there.
Oh, yeah, there's some brands that are, I think, at the moment trying to navigate, what happens when your brand is co-opted by a movement as a signal, right? What happens when your logo becomes recognizably associated with a far-right leader. And that's a very tricky position for any premium brand to be in, because in one sense, it's worked. And in another sense, did you intend for this to happen? Probably not.
Is this an extension of the peer-to-peer networks then, really, is the way we could look at social media? It was always said, wasn't it, many years ago, that I've worked in radio for years, and the best form of advertising for a radio program was always word of mouth.
Yeah.
Right? The idea that, somebody you knew said, oh, this is great, you'll love it. And then obviously that would be a much stronger pull than seeing an advert or a billboard or whatever. Are we now at the point then that people are using their social media as their own peer-to-peer network, do we think, and trusting that far more than they would anything else?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the dangers, is the fact that you mentioned radio and word of mouth and so on. But that still would fall under regulations or under control and so on, some sense of control and things like that there. We live in an age now through social media and word of mouth where we don't have that control. We're hiding behind a keyboard. We're hiding behind our phones. And then that goes out not just to one person or to a small network or to thousands. That goes out to millions. That goes out 24/7. I refer, for example, to your excellent work, Claire, on the finite and infinite attention and so on.
Yeah.
We only have, as you like to say, a finite degree of attention span.
Finite attention span,
yeah. But if you fire everything out en masse and so on, some of that is going to land because it's out there so much. Some of it's going to seep through.
Yeah, in that environment where we are facing infinite content fighting for very finite attention, the thing that I think you identify, and from rereading into particularly, let's say, ISIS's operations from over the last 10 years, they're very good in a way at grabbing attention in these very theatrical and dynamic ways, right? And that's only evolved in the last few years, mostly picking up on the tactics and cues to kind of bring people in, but then saying something slightly shouty or abrasive or more contentious than anything. And that does get the eyeballs, right?
10 years ago, obviously, ISIS were definitely seen as the big threat. I'm not saying they've been replaced, but there are other threats around that keep popping up. It's part of the problem here that actually we have no way also of controlling who the bad actors are. We have, it may be ISIS one week, it may be Russia next, it may be various other things, and these groups just keep changing.
I think all these threats do coexist as well. Like ISIS hasn't gone away, right?
Yeah. I'm engaged in another early stage piece of research around analysing Taliban activity online and implications that may have westwards. We know from conversations with those in different positions of authority and so on that Afghanistan isn't seen as the cool topic of the minute.
Yeah.
But we also know from what we're researching, it very well could be in the not too distant future. Things go in cycles, but it's always still lurking there. And to go back to the conversation there a couple of minutes ago around brands and so on, we also have within these different groups their own competition to be the leading brand. So they're going to have to engage in a strategy where they may be seen much more extreme, much more visible, and so on, because they're competing with other brands within that sector.
That's happening in West Africa right now, isn't it? With the battle between effectively Al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIS affiliates.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's conducted over social media.
Yeah, so you're going to have that who's going to win out on those metaphorical internal battles as such within the marketplace. Who's going to be the leading brand coming out of that there? What strategy are they going to adopt to ensure that their brand becomes the one that everybody within that sector wants to be a part of?
You can see why it feels culturally salient, culturally important, I should say. And attractive, I think, particularly to a certain kind of young man who lacks power, means, purpose, approval from any authority figure in their life, that this seems like the way forward, because they're not just demonstrating that they have power, they're also demonstrating that, you can join this as a young man and get a degree of autonomy and power that no one else is giving you.
Yeah, and you're hidden as such as well behind the screen, behind the keyboard. So you have that degree of anonymity to express views, to express opinions that can't be fact-checked to the same degree, given the amount that's out there. And that provides, again, a degree of hidden power, as well as reassurance that I'm involved in something here, I'm doing something, but I'm also protected to a certain degree.
And just on that, do you find the same applies maybe in a different way? Because we've also got this trad wife movement, haven't we?
Which the Venn diagram of far-right extremists and jihadi contest definitely overlaps with the protection of women. Right?
Yeah.
So is the same thing applying to women at all that applies to men?
Yeah, that's interesting. We've had that conversation actually ourselves, Claire, about the tendency of some females to actually buy into this sense of the distinction between strong male and the traditional wife and so on. So we are seeing that trend. And you mentioned there about there's Islamic jihadists on the far right side.
Yeah.
We've explored the differences, but there are also some similarities there. And this sense of strong masculine identity protective of the female is something which we can see right across the different extreme networks, be they on the far right or Islamic jihadist side. So what's interesting about all this research is also the similarities as well as the differences, is this sense of looking back by the far right and a quasi almost victim mentality within the right in terms of their experiences.
Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, that again, the research in Northern Ireland has provided some interesting building blocks for research on the far right, where we find that from within Loyalism, there's much more likely to be that sense of victim-based narrative where they were victims of an aggressor as such in the conflict. That same mindset you can see within the far right, where they feel they're victims of their circumstances now, where society is changing around them. Their place in society is under threat. And you can see that victim-based narrative mentality coming through in their posts and narratives.
Given that we've got this confluence of history and media and, the kind of slightly broken society you were talking about, if I said to you, Keir Starmer's stepping down today, you are now the Prime Minister, very sorry about that, what would you do? I mean, are we talking about building... Run, run's not a bad idea.
Fix the country, Stephen. Small.
But are we talking about building those kind of structures that we talked about, the kind of community things like the BBC, like the NHS, really supporting things like that, maybe community centres, just to give people a sense that they do actually have a voice in their own space? Or are we talking about far more bigger concepts that need to be tackled here?
I do think it needs to be built from the ground up. I do think there needs to be a much greater focus on community cohesion from a ground level. And I think, dare I say it, I do think the structures of the state, be it from the media to actual Westminster Village and so on, do need to recognise that much more goes on in society beyond the confines or within the M25. And I think that is a...
No.
And just for those listening, outside the UK, the M25 is the London orbital motorway. So basically anywhere outside London.
Yeah, and there are a number of issues which are localised, yes, but they do need to be built from the ground up, but also recognised. And so within that M25 corridor, that there's much more exists than beyond London. And I think that is something that it's the elephant in the room in many respects with regards to the UK. And some don't want maybe to recognise that, but I do think it's an important issue. It has to be addressed. For the UK to function as a collective, I do think we need to recognise the local issues that arise across the UK. And that requires greater community cohesion, a return to real sense of togetherness, that we are more united than divided at the end of the day. And that rather than presenting a perpetual negative outlook on society, that we actually try to say, right, what are the positives here? What we can actually say that actually puts a smile on people's faces. We see and hear so much now about what's wrong with this and what's wrong here and so on. But there's a lot which is right. And if we could champion that a lot more, I think it would be a lot better place.
Well, that was Dr. Stephen Herron from Queen's University Belfast. Fascinating, Claire, and worrying, I would say.
And worrying, deeply worrying.
Yeah. And look, I think, we're going to try to bring you during the course of this podcast moments of hope, but there will be moments of, oh dear.
Oh dear.
That's just the nature of where we're at, I think.
Yeah, I think in the past, this might not have been feel so intractable because you could reach multiple people and you can see what people are talking about or what they're thinking about or how these things appeal to different people. But, increasingly as our online life has become our entire social life, and that's become incredibly optimized and siloed, it's getting really, really difficult to both see what's going on, but also understand and figure out how to reach people as well, right? We're creating these deserts of information. And that disconnection from each other is probably one of the most worrying and one of the most difficult things to overcome in the attention economy.
Absolutely agree. A reminder, you can get in contact with us at any time. The email address, Claire, is
canwehaveyourattention@protonmail.com.
Thank you very much. Can we have your attention at protonmail.com? We'll see you next week. Thanks, Claire.
See you next week. Thanks, James.